What's going on, collective listeners? Welcome back to another episode of the Samson Strength Coach Collective Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Grasso. Today, we are joined by Terrance McLellan. He is a strength coach in professional basketball. He has a wide variety of experiences, and we really get into a few different topics. We try to stay along kind of the early parts of the journey, some of the mistakes made, some of the solutions we provide to some of those mistakes, especially for your younger listeners out there that are listening. And then we start to really dive into what it looks like to be a leader and how to take some of those experiences and apply them as you go from being an intern to then having interns. So awesome stuff, some great wisdom, some great insight from Terrance himself. And yeah, you guys will enjoy this episode. Here we go. Terry, what's going on, brother? Appreciate you hopping on, especially with the start of the season upon us. So hopefully you're doing well, though, man. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of talk to us a little bit about your journey, and yeah, we'll kind of roll from there. I know you and I go back to the Quinnipiac days as a lot of the people that I've had on this podcast, but yeah, man, I'm pumped to have you on. I'm pumped to kind of see what you're up to and just to catch up and to see what you've been about. But yeah, why don't you kind of introduce yourself a little bit and just kind of take us way back to where this whole thing started and where you're heading now.
For sure. No, I appreciate you having me. So start really where I'm from. I'm a Maine native, born and raised. So by myself down here in Atlanta, a lot of folks are kind of like, Maine, where's that?
Where's Maine?
But no, basically started out in undergrad, actually thought I wanted to go to school to be an engineer and end up being an architect. And after a year doing that, discovered that was not it for me. Was in school playing college lacrosse and really just had a passion for training. And my roommate at the time was like, hey man, you can do this for a living. And I was like, stop it. No way. So fast forward, looked into that, spoke to some administration at school, got into exercise science, and kind of undergrad from there was history. After undergrad, it was kind of unheard of at my university for anybody that wanted to do strength and conditioning. It was really more like, I would say, ex-phys, personal training, kind of group exercise with that program in that department at the time. So there was less than 5 of us. I actually remember this specifically. In order to graduate, we needed to do an internship. And we all still joke about it, but basically they're like, we have no idea how to go about this. We'll leave it up to you guys to figure it out, and we're there to support you.
Gee, thanks.
And so it's pretty funny because, in Maine, there aren't too many schools in Maine. At that time, I was not willing to kind of leave the state. And at that time, Matt King, the name, was at University of Maine, Orono. And I just kind of reached out to him. Donna Strout, she was at Bowdoin at the time, and a few others. And King was the first guy, basically said, hell yeah, come on up. What do you need from me? And that was pretty smooth sailing, if you will. And then that was the intro. And after that, I was pretty much hooked.
Yeah.
And then, not to take up too much more time with that, but I bounced around from really after that undergrad private sector to JUCO to Division III to Division I, and now where I'm at in professional basketball. So it was quite a journey for about 5 years before I decided to go to grad school. I almost bought a house, and 2 months later I'm in grad school in a different state. So pretty crazy how things go, but here we are. Wouldn't change it for the world.
That is wild, man. And yeah, you were at Springfield right as I was interning at Quinnipiac when you were at Springfield, right? Is that
No,
I think that was the timeline, right? Yeah. Okay.
Correct.
Yeah.
So my stint was kind of like JUCO, Central Maine Community College. From there, grad school, Springfield College. Short stint down at Duke University, then Quinnipiac. We crossed paths.
Yeah.
And then honestly, the last couple of years with COVID were a whirlwind. Five
Yeah.
states in 12 months. So
Yeah, seriously, that's awesome, man. Well, I
journey.
mean, so yeah, I mean, along that path, obviously, you got, you've been bouncing around, right? And you kind of are in this. How old were you when you were at Springfield? Because I think we were both. Are we the same age? How old are you?
I'm 31.
Yeah, I'm
Just
32.
turned
So I thought, yeah,
September.
and I remember like I was an intern at Quinnipiac. I was like one of those older interns, right? And B always had kind of like older interns, you know what I mean? But I
Hmm.
remember thinking, yeah, like, there's definitely some like older people around here who are still trying to make it happen. So that made me feel a little bit more comfort because, the reality is, right, like, is like a 26-year-old at the time, or I was like 27 maybe or something like that. You start thinking about like, hey, like maybe this isn't going to work out for me. You know what I mean? About it's
No
like
doubt.
you're bouncing around, you're not, you're getting, doing unpaid internships, whatever it is. But yeah, so you were a little bit older when you were at Springfield as well. And so how did that kind of
Sure.
like happen as far as just like being able to stay motivated and being able to stay determined as far as like, all right, I see there's something here. I'm going to keep chipping away at this thing. And,
Yeah.
for all those who are listening, who are kind of in that same boat right now, just trying to like chip away, but it's really tough to see like what's behind these walls and if there is anything at all.
Yeah. I mean, you know, my journey with Springfield, again, being a guy from Maine, we're pretty closed off to a lot of things. Like,
Yeah.
we always joke music comes later, news comes later, so it feels like.
Yeah.
And so Springfield was actually the only grad school I applied to. And at the time, I had emailed Dr. T. He reached out or got back to me and basically said, we're full for the next year.
Mm,
Feel free to apply for the following year. And I'm like, cool, not a problem.
sure.
I'm this naive guy. I have no idea what Springfield College is. And I'm sure a lot of listeners might be cracking
Yeah.
up, but
Yeah.
it's
Right.
just like I had no idea. So I was like, hey, like, at the time I think I was 25.
Yeah.
And I was just like, if this is something I'm going to do, I need to feel like this is the right move.
Mhm.
Grad school one isn't cheap. It's a huge jump. Like I said, I was considering buying a house. So I took this leap of faith. I was just like, I'm coming down to visit. Can I set up some time, speak with you? Spoke with some GAs, second year grad students at Springfield at the time.
Mm,
And by the end of the trip, he was like, you know what? Like, get your stuff in ASAP and I'll get you in for the fall, like for this fall.
nice.
And so as soon as I got home, got everything in, and like I said, did not end up getting a house. And a couple months later, I'm moving to Western Mass. So
Yeah.
as I get to Springfield, though, again, being that older guy, I'll never forget everyone. My nickname was Dad in the group because a lot of these kids are fresh out of undergrad
Yeah.
or like maybe spend 1 year after undergrad working. And I was definitely one of the older guys. So I just needed to feel like that was the right fit and I was
Mm,
making the right choice. Cause again, it's at least 2 years that you're committing to with, a possibility of continuing chasing this dream, if
sure.
you will. So
Yeah, no doubt. And at that time, when did you kind of start to? Because after that, obviously, I know you obviously we talked about spending some time at Quinnipiac, and I guess there's the basketball element at Quinnipiac. But at what time are you
yeah.
kind of starting to see your little bit of a gravitational pull towards basketball? When did that kind of start to
Yeah.
happen?
So I knew very early, like as soon as I started at the JUCO, my two sports were basketball. I had a ton of other sports, but like I knew that was going to be my niche, if you
Yeah,
will.
yeah,
A lot of folks in the field told me I was crazy. Basketball players are difficult to work with.
mm,
And I remember looking at everybody and I'm just like, I don't know why you guys feel that way. They're actually some of the most energetic, motivated. I think with any athlete, you just got to find what makes them tick.
sure,
And I'd never really had that issue. So at that JUCO, I knew and going on to Springfield, it was really like, in order to do this at the next level, this is what I needed to do at that point in time.
mm,
And again, fast forward, knowing what Springfield College is, it was a phenomenal opportunity. And then, I get this opportunity with Brajesh after an internship with him. I just couldn't say no to.
yeah,
Whereas, like, you're going to work with me, but you're going to travel with men's basketball. And for years to come, like, I mean, that really set me up for more success than anything.
Yeah.
Not to mention all the people you met along the way. So
Yeah, that's fantastic, dude. Yeah, I can imagine that, because I remember like when I was there, that was like when that position was starting to kind of get like built out a little bit, you know what I mean? And they kind of like
yeah,
messed around with like Jamie being in that position or whatever. But I think it's awesome. And then obviously you were there at Quinnipiac for it was like a year and a half, 2 years maybe. Was it 2 years?
yeah. So it's kind of funny if you include my internship, it was basically like 2.5, 3 years.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it was quite some time.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so prior to, and I think it's interesting about the basketball thing because I remember when I was working with basketball athletes, working in the private sector, my initial exposure was the same thing. People would be like, "Hey, man, like they just want to play basketball. Like basketball players just want to play basketball. They don't want to worry about training. They don't want to think about those things." And talking with a lot of basketball strength coaches, like over the years, whether it be like some of the stops that I've been at or just people in general, it seems that like they had the same presumptions going into whatever position, and then it completely changes once you figure out, like you said, how to reach the athlete, how to figure out a way to express like, hey, like here's what I'm going to provide, and I'm not coming in like guns a blazing, right? Like saying that like this is the only way that we can go about doing it. I understand that you care about your jump shot. I understand that there's a little bit more of a finesse element to your game, right? There's a little more elasticity involved in basketball than some of the other brute sports that like some of us may come from, right? And so I think there's sort of like a finessing that needs to take place, right? So how have you handled that for those who may be experiencing that type of, because I would imagine really basketball athletes are no different than any other athlete, right? If you don't come correct, right, and actually come with some sort of correct way approach to trying to reach them and connect with them, then they're going to shut you out regardless of whatever sport it is, right? And they're just going to think, I don't want to train, I'm literally just going to play my sport and forget this guy or girl, whatever. How have you approached that in your experience in order to get yourself to a point where you haven't had that type of experience, where you haven't had basketball players who just want to play basketball? Is there a specific way that you've kind of gone about it, or is it really just, you being you?
Yeah, I mean, I think with any sport, you're definitely going to have those individuals that are more cautious, I guess you could say, in terms of opening up or trusting you with, in college, it's 4 years more often than not, especially at the mid major level. And now it's like I could have a guy for a week, I could have a guy for a month or the entire season. Um, I always say you got to be genuine, you got to be authentic, and we're kind of beating a broken record with, you got to get to know the individual, and the famous quote, "No one cares how much you know till I know how much you care." I really just think it's you being yourself and not trying to put on a show or a mask and be something that you're not. And by no means like did I do that at an early age. Like I probably tried to put on a mask early on in my career. We probably all did, and tried to be something we weren't. And you find out pretty quickly, like that ain't me. And I worked with other sports where I felt I had to be a certain way, and it was just like, I'm not being myself. I'm not being genuine. I'm not being authentic. And that was something that was like, at Springfield, Dr. T would say he gave everybody a little mirror, and he's like, you look at this self every night when you go home and ask yourself, like, are you you? Are you genuine? Are you authentic? Or, what could have been? And that was something that has just stuck with me. And I try to help a lot of others is exactly that. Just first things first, find out who you are, what motivates you, really what's your why as to why you're doing this. But really, once you figure that out, becoming a coach is pretty easy, I'd like to say.
Yeah. And I think, like to your point, I think we all did that at a certain age. It's usually typically when you're younger, right? Younger coaches tend to try to feel like they need to be something that they may or may not be, and sometimes, unfortunately, we need to do that in order to kind of exist in certain roles, right? And to be able to kind of progress onto from one, role to the next role, and be able to actually exist in this field. Like I said, it's unfortunate, but it is a reality, right? And it might not just be this profession. It could be literally any profession where it's like, yeah, all right, well, this is kind of who my boss needs me to be, and I need to do what's best for myself, right? And that's to be who this guy needs me to be in this particular situation, so I can move on. And I think there's ways to do that without completely compromising your integrity. You know what I mean? But obviously you've been in situations, I'm sure, as a coach, right, where you've witnessed other coaches trying to be something that they are not, right? So as you can imagine, you can only imagine what the player is feeling, right, or what they're thinking, because all right, I can. The players see through everything. I mean, they're easily the smartest people in the room.
No question.
So it's like, especially like, I feel like it's like, you have like high school and collegiate, but like the further you go up from those levels and the further you go down from those levels, like I feel like the younger you get for like pre-high school and then like, professional leagues, it's like they just know, you know what I mean? There's just something like gravitating. Whereas I think a little bit in high school and college, there's a little bit of sort of like they kind of know they have to do what they're told type of situation. So they kind of, go in, unfortunately, right. There's a lot of like rigidity in terms of like their scheduling and all that kind of stuff. But yeah. So have you experienced that? And if you have experienced that, like other coaches kind of, operating or acting a little bit, like what were your thoughts towards that and kind of your experience towards like how you saw the players reacting to some of those situations, if you have come across them?
That's a difficult one to answer. I've always said in any stop along the way, from internships to each position along the way to where I'm at now, you always are in the moment discovering things you either like or you don't like. And no matter what, it's still a growth opportunity, but really figuring out like, hey, if this isn't what you like, make note of it and kind of make yourself aware of not doing that because of maybe how you felt in that moment, how that athlete felt. And so when you see other coaches, it's more or less just an awareness piece of like, hey, that's how they handle that. Maybe I'd handle it this way or go about things this way and take it really just as a growth opportunity for yourself. And again, based on your position, if it's an intern, you can kind of guide and coach them along the way. But if it's your superior, then you kind of just make note and keep to yourself and continue on your journey.
So you're saying that for all the listeners, if their boss is doing something they don't like, they shouldn't go and shouldn't go and let them know exactly how they feel, him or her, how they feel. Yeah. That's a smart move for sure. Yeah, I think it's tough. I think it's one of those things where it's like, I think like creating red flags was always kind of the way that I put, like taking notes, right? Like any situation or any position I've been in, like I'm just taking notes, like I'm trying to be here. And it's not to say that you don't get more emotionally attached to certain positions and certain roles, because obviously at some point when you're spending your time, energy, and effort, showing up to this job every single day, at some point you want to feel like if there's something that you think you see a flaw, you want to feel like you can actually have the autonomy or actually have a voice be heard to try to make some of those changes. Do you feel like you've been afforded that opportunity in a lot of the stops that you've been at? Have your superiors really given you the opportunity to voice your thoughts? I know B has always, kind of asked us what we thought, right? And he was always really open to hearing our thoughts, right? But has that always been the case, or have you kind of had a little bit of both?
Definitely had a little bit of both. For any listener, if you're in the Northeast, if you're not, little plug for Brajesh Patel at Quinnipiac, and you can speak to this. If you can spend time with that man, you need to. He pulls the best out of you, his athletes, really anybody around him. He's one of those guys, like we speak almost every day, but like I miss those conversations because it was always like, hey man, here's what I'm thinking. What are your thoughts?
Right.
Good or bad, they're willing to listen. Now at other stops, it could be the opposite, where you just know like it's probably not right or your place to speak your mind. And
sure,
again, it is what it is, and we accept that. But I would say that is one stop that I'm forever indebted for, and I'm the coach I am today because of that man. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, B does really bring out the best. And I think I've mentioned a few different podcasts the way he kind of had the strategic way of knowing exactly where you were at and different ways to try to meet you along that journey, right? He knew what
Mhm.
questions he needed to ask you in order to keep you on your toes so that you would be forced to go find the answers to those questions. And obviously, try to dig a little bit deeper to get the best out of you. So now you're 31. And I think like as 32, like
Come on, man. Don't don't
well, I know.
remind me, man.
I know it's weird going down
Oh
this path,
shit.
but it's crazy because like obviously like at some point like I was obviously an intern and then I had interns, right? And it's funny
Yeah.
because like there is much of like like it obviously like yes, like if you're an intern, I don't want to say that there's no difference between an intern and a full-time assistant, but a lot of these situations that you find yourselves in, I've been fortunate enough to be around really high quality full-time assistants when I was an intern, and then when I was a full-time assistant I was, supported by some really, really high quality interns. And so to me,
Mhm.
there wasn't as much of a difference, right? It was just like, it just happened to be where everybody was at along their stops at this particular time in their journey.
Right.
But it was like us just having conversation and moving from there. So have you had, interns now, or at least like in the past, right? And since moving on from being an intern yourself, and have you kind of approached it in that same way? Have you tried to take some of the things that you learned from some of the guys who treated you well as an intern and try to put those forward? And what would be some of those kind of like philosophical traits that you're trying to instill in some of your interns?
Yeah, I mean, so my second year at Quinnipiac, my final year, part of a project I had done for my master's, but B also let me take it on just head on, was the internship itself.
Nice.
So I developed an intern curriculum, kind of piecing things together of all my experiences throughout my journey and all my internships. And, pretty similar, like I said earlier, it's like, first things first, like you need to understand who you are before anything else. In like, start with why, what's your why? Like, that's probably first book anybody I recommend getting into this field, or really any field, like start with that, understand that. And really from there, it can kind of stem 100 different ways based on, like you said, where you're at, whether they have a background in exercise science or they're just starting a grad program in exercise science. Like you can tailor it many different ways, but first and foremost, like you need to be a good person and really being genuine, being authentic, like don't pretend. And that'll be really the big stone to build on
Mm.
for anybody. So um don't have any interns right now. Man, it would be great to have some. Not something I would say, it's not something professional basketball as a whole allows, but right now the organization, we just don't have any on our side.
Sure.
But I've said this to many folks, and I'll say this at the end, like I am willing to speak to anybody. That's something along the way I was really kind of turned off by, with reaching out to coaches. Like we all have 5-10 minutes. Like it's
Sure.
difficult to find that time, but be willing to speak to the next generation, because at some point in time they're going to be in your shoes. So
Yeah.
I'm always willing to talk to the next generation. And really, for anybody listening, like I'll give my information at the end, but don't hesitate to reach out, and happy to chat with you for as much time as I can.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I don't know if I've mentioned on this podcast before, but everybody always says like even some of like the top guys would be like, oh yeah, be nice to your interns because you might end up working for them one day. And it's funny because the position that I'm in now, my supervisor is a former intern of mine. And I thought
Yeah,
like, what I mean? And at the time, like again, it was the same situation where it's like, yeah, he was like a technical intern. He was actually a full-time
right.
assistant somewhere else, but he was actually just interning for the summer or whatever. So he wasn't like, it was we worked together, you know what I mean? But like the
Sure,
technical role was like intern, and that was kind
sure.
of how we met, right? So it's like, and it's why and I I see him in the same light that he probably saw me, you know, and it's just the way the roles are. And I treated the same way. And I think it was good because for me, it was just kind of like, they asked me, right? Like when I first started, they were like, do you want to do that? And I was like, yes, absolutely. Like, I think it should, because I wanted to just show all the people like who say that, but don't actually act on that. Right. It's like, hey, it could actually happen. You know what I mean? Like, this is how it goes. Yeah, for sure. Have you seen that happen before, at least in like, you're in basketball before, or is that or any other sports that you've been around?
Yeah. I mean, so I haven't experienced it firsthand, but I know a handful of folks that have, and I know a handful of folks that applied for a job and didn't get a job and find out like they had a poor experience, and that played a huge role in that position and that hiring. It's so it's like I said, like first and foremost, like everyone remembers who you are. Hopefully everyone's had a good experience. And really those interns, that next generation is crucial to not just really our field, if you will, but like the entire medical profession as a whole is like, we just got to continue to support this next generation, whether they want to be a strength coach or they have no idea. Open yourself up and be a voice for them and guide them. So
yeah, well, I mean, I think a good, kind of building off of that would be like talking about the specific flaws that you have experienced, right? Like, I don't want to say like the specific flaws that are in the strength and conditioning industry, because I think everybody probably has their own version of what they see those flaws being based off of what their experiences are and their journey, and some of the things that they had to be exposed to along the way. But for you, what were, we'll get into some of the positives, but to start off, what were some of the flaws that you felt are, were relevant then and are probably still relevant now, in the field of strength and conditioning?
I would say one that's probably going to be very hard to go away is the logo. There's clicks associated with it. I always just say, like, never forget where you came from. I started at a JUCO. I still go back to that JUCO and show my face and check on the sports and talk to those athletes, share stories. I was a teacher, adjunct professor when I was there. And so, like, again, just if there's one person along the way that has a thought about doing what we're doing, I try to provide, my experiences, my journey, really any of that, and guide them in any way I can. And so I would say that's the biggest thing, is like, we can't get stuck on like where we're at in our logo, because at one point in time, I can't speak for everybody, but you were at either a JUCO Division I private sector, like low major D1 school, like everybody started somewhere, and now we're at where we're at. And so we got to be able to return the favor to those just starting. So
for sure,
that's probably the biggest. And there's other minute things, but I think that's easily the biggest thing. It's got to be moved away from, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it's funny because I think, somebody who I'd had on the podcast, I mentioned like they would like to hear from some more coaches at smaller schools, right? And I think that's something that I feel like all the time, where it's like, all right, like, well, have this like podcast. It's like, are you supposed to have like famous people on? You know what I mean? It's like, are you supposed to have like people who are like, I don't know, like whatever you want to call big time, you know what I mean? It's like, is that how you get like listeners or whatever? You just, I personally think it's just, quality conversation, and whoever is willing to listen will listen. But, I think, and it was great. It was great to see that like people really are interested to see like and I think those are some of the best conversations, like those people who've had exposure to some of those, smaller schools where there's a lack of resources, and there's a lot of grinding and hustling going on. Right. And I think there's a little bit more of a, a reality aspect to what's going on there. And so I think it's really interesting. And I think that's really important that you pointed that out as one of the flaws, right? Because I think oftentimes we're like, oh, like I'm going to pass up this internship at this school because I need to get, and it's not to say that larger logos don't help on the resume sometimes, even just as a conversation starter. You know what I mean? Some of these bigger schools and stuff, I get it. And I'm just as guilty. I don't know if I'll say guilty, but like I did the same thing. You know what I mean? When I went down to Alabama, I was like, all right, well, it's a conversation starter. Whereas like tell people all the time, like, yeah, I was at like Alabama and I was at like Quinnipiac and then UConn or whatever. And then like they don't think too much about it or whatever. Like, oh, I was in the private sector or whatever. And it's like some of these smaller spaces where you have this one-on-one contact with your mentor or somebody else. I mean, that's where the greatest value and the greatest, actual development is actually taking place, So I think that there's
100%.
something to be said about that. I'm sure you could speak to that too, obviously, given your experiences,
For sure. I would say the biggest piece with that too is like the creativity piece. Those coaches, like, they have to become so creative with their space, their resources, and really understanding like, hey, I might only have 2 racks. Like when I was at a JUCO, I had 1 trap bar, and I'm working with 4 or 5 teams in total, but it's just like you got to figure out a way to get it done. And so you really like you become a great coach when you go through those experiences. Not to say you don't in the others as well, but you definitely got to put your thinking cap on for sure.
Yeah, no doubt. And so I guess transitioning into some of the positives, right? Like what are some of the things that you think we're doing pretty well right now as an industry and not even just college or professional strength and conditioning, but just the fitness industry in general? What are some of the things that you feel from your experiences, the things you've been exposed to that are what you would consider to be positives and pros and what's going on now currently?
I would say, the biggest piece is at least in my experience, is pushing the envelope with, we always say we're not reinventing the wheel, but I do think in some aspects there's a lot of coaches that are not necessarily reinventing, but maybe just restructuring that wheel.
Right.
And so there's, with all the tech and utilizing the tech and implementing any changes and things like that, like, I mean, a lot of this tech, honestly, for me is new.
Sure.
And I'm fascinated by, the changes you can have and conversations you can have with your peers, really just based off some of that stuff. So pushing the envelope is really, I think, going to be the biggest thing. And really outside of that, it's just continue doing what your scope is and work with your peers that are in another scope, collaborating together and, rowing the boat together, if you will. So,
yeah, for sure. As far as that scope goes, have you talking about the idea of, understanding the specific scopes and then like kind of getting a better understanding of how they mesh together? How has that been, in your experience, kind of working your way through, like, has it changed over the years? And like, we'll talk a little bit about like your ability to be able to kind of grasp the concepts of, hey, there needs to be some sort of like interdepartmental synergy between what's going on here so that we can actually give the athlete the best possible experience. Is that something that you feel you've been able to dive into a little bit in your experiences in the previous, as you've kind of progressed through this entire field?
for sure. I mean, so again, when you start in really any stop, when you're working with any sports team, it's you and one athletic trainer for that sports team. Maybe you got a PT, sports psych within that, organization or university. Whereas like where I'm at now, it's a team, man. And so the ability to collaborate, it's like you have some of the most in-depth conversations. B always talks about going down the rabbit hole. Like, find yourself just going down the rabbit hole on one individual and there's 4 of us, 5 of us involved. Like, things can get pretty deep and sometimes too deep, I would like to say. But it's just like the ability to collaborate with that many individuals on one individual, like, huge valuable piece that I've never kind of understood. And I think a lot of universities now are adopting this high performance model. Like we always say, like, what does that actually mean? I just think the ability to collaborate with more than one individual, or even if it is one individual, like actually collaborate, not just, hey, we communicate daily, but like sit down and, hey, I got Anthony Grasso today. This is what we're working on. Like, what's your thoughts? What are you seeing? Like, really breaking it down and developing that plan. Like, man, that's something years ago. I'm like, I wonder if things would have ended up differently for this individual if,
Yeah.
you're able to do that. So,
Yeah. I think there'd be a lot of athletes, former athletes that want to do the
yeah,
same thing, you know what I mean? And maybe even former coaches, right? Like, I think it's always like unfortunate when you see people lose their jobs. I hate to see people lose their jobs, but you always wonder, like, well, if we had a better system for synergy and communication, maybe people wouldn't have to lose their jobs, right? Like
right.
and there's two sides of that. It's like maybe they wouldn't have to lose their jobs because we would have a little bit more of an open-mindedness to just trying to work with individuals, even if the season or whatever, particular metric you're basing their success off of didn't go the way you'd like it to go. Or maybe the flip side of that is, like maybe we would have won more games. And if that is the metric that, we're all graded on, right? Like winning games, then
Mhm.
if that's the criteria we need to have to keep our jobs, then yeah, maybe some more communication and better, collaboration could have kept some coaches their jobs, and probably could have, kept athletes on the court, ice, field longer, right? And had better experiences. You know what I mean? I think it is really unfortunate though, when you see that being the demise, when you see like coaches getting in the way of an athlete's experience, and like, that ego really being the determining factor in their inability to see that they're
Mm.
sort of like creating this really negative, whatever, like college or professional experience for the athlete. You know what I mean? It's just, I don't know. Yeah, it's sad, but it's like, it is a reality though. And I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying before. It's like, well, you know, some of the pros are like, we're actually starting to collaborate a little more now. You know what I mean? There's a lot
Yeah,
of that, right? And it's like, what is the high performance model? It's just talking more. You know what I mean? It's really
right.
just like, you could have like, I'm sure, there's a ton of great blueprints out there and ton of different models on like how to go about doing it. But yeah, there probably be probably be a lot of players who were like, hey man, like how do we have, because I think it was like when we first started like getting exposed to this stuff, there's a lot of players who were like, there are a lot of coaches who were like, man, I wish I had this when I was, training, right?
Yeah,
And I think that the second wave of that would be like, all right, as we start to collaborate more and we have a little more of that cohesive factor we're looking for, you're going to get a lot of coaches who then get into the field and be like, oh man, I wish the coaches that I was working with when I was training actually had this type of collaboration, and they were actually
mm.
working together and working off of a similar blueprint, as opposed to everybody just working in their silos. I think that's probably the next wave of, I guess, like wishful thinking or like complaints, you know what I mean, to come our way
Yeah.
for people who work in the strength and conditioning field, unfortunately.
No, for sure.
Yeah. Well, all right, we got a few minutes left. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but so kind of getting into, you're talking about those experiences, right? And I don't mean to kind
Mm.
of bring you back down memory lane, but if you want to kind of talk about, just briefly, some things that you've done in your career that you may have, would you kind of like want to walk back at this point, right? And then something that, you felt was like an actual determining factor in your career, right? So I guess one thing that you would say is like, you know what, thinking about that's one of those like, 3 a.m. like anxiety thoughts. You kind of like wake up in the middle of the night, you're like, I can't believe I did that shit, blah, blah, blah. And then obviously something that you're like, hey, this was a defining moment in my career. Maybe they're the same, right? And
Mm.
kind of a positive on that note, and we'll kind of wrap up from there.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing, and everyone always talks about the grind, but I still reflect on, being in grad school, Springfield, interning down at Quinnipiac. There's another two of us, grad students. We'd leave at like 3:34 in the morning just to get down to Quinnipiac, hour drive, if there isn't traffic on the
Yeah.
highway, to set up and be ready for that first lift, be there all day long, and then come all the way back to Springfield, be in class 7 to 9:30 at night.
Mm.
And for a lot of folks, like, we always talk about the grind, but it's one of those things that, like, I reflect on it like, man, I can't believe I did that. But there was a ton of growth from that. Because honestly, I tell folks back home and they're like, what's wrong with you? Why would you why? And so I chuckle about it now and really embrace the growth that came from that. But really it's just one of those things like, I'm just like, dang, I don't know if I could do that again.
Dude, let me tell you, I know I can't. Like I think the same thing all the time. Like I think about it all the time. I'm just like, and I'm afraid that I'm like getting soft because I'm like, dang, dude, like I don't know if I can do that right now. Like I don't know if I could like wake up at 3:45, drive an hour just so that I can get a lift in at UConn before the developmental group came in or whatever. It's like you're deadlifting at 5 a.m. after driving an hour. You know what I mean? Just slowly sipping your espresso on the way in, just so that you can have some sort of juice when you walk through that door. And it's just like I think about it now and I'm like, I was talking about someone yesterday. I'm like, I don't know if I can do that. I don't want to do that. You know what I mean? It's just like, I'm like, am I getting soft? Like, cause I bet there's still dudes out there who are like my age or older who are still doing that kind of stuff. And it's like, I don't know, man. I don't know, but I agree. I'm always just like, dude, I don't know if I can do that anymore. I definitely don't want to though. I know I don't, you know?
Yeah. So that's definitely something I always reflect on. And then what was the other part 2 of your question there?
Well, I'm kind of thinking that's kind of, you know, the way it needed to be answered, right? It's like you talked about, because I think that answer is twofold. Number one, it's like we glamorize and glorify the grind, right? In a lot of ways, right? And that can be a potential like negative, like some ways that we might like there's definitely times in my life, in my career, being a strength coach where I don't want to say I regret or I'm embarrassed or I like want to walk back or I would have done the situation differently. The amount of like those times where I was like, man, I was really like scrapping there. You know what I mean? Like I was really trying and because at the same time, like you said, like there's a ton of growth that comes from that. And there's times where like, I'm like, dang, like, you know, I might be tougher on the younger generation or the next generation because of the fact that I went through those things. So I expect them to go through those same things as well to sort of experience that. And it's not always a one-to-one correlation. It doesn't always need to be that way. Everyone's going to have their own approach and their own experience. I think the people who really love what they do and are really just kind of in that, like I was in that mode where I was just like, I don't know. It's just what I got to do. Like, I don't even think about it. Like, it's just what I got to do. I got to go to get it done. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think about how I feel about it, you know? But I think the other side too is I was, you know, my second question was like, well, what are some of like the positive things, the more defining moments? And that's definitely a defining moment, right? Like a defining moment would be those more like those. It's not just like 1 or 2 mornings. You're talking about like over and over and over, like the discipline to just like to do it over and over again. I'm not talking just for a semester. I mean, talking years and years and years of the same schedule, the same things. You know what I mean? But we just like stayed it. And it's funny because like I look back on it now and I don't think like I think about it in a way where I'm like, man, am I different now? Am I that different? It's like, no, I just think your approach to certain things changes. Maybe you get more efficient. Maybe the idea is that like you're now in a position where you can reap the benefits of that and there's challenges now, right? I'm sure you can, you know, attest to that, right? Like there's going to be certain challenges now that you'll look back on in 5 years and be like, dang, I can't believe I was doing that then. I can't believe I was able to make that happen then. You know what I mean? So, yeah, no, I think that, you know what I mean? Yeah. I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that. I didn't mean to cut you off, but that was I kind of like basically answered your question for you. But yeah, I think that's a great answer. I think that's a defining moment and one that you're like, man, I don't know. Like, that's tough. I don't know if I could do that again.
Yeah. I have kind of 2 other thoughts. I got one. We'll see if the other one comes back to me. But, you know, the biggest thing I continue to say to others, again, have these conversations day to day is like, you got to be willing to take chances and not be afraid of change.
Right.
And that was something I kind of embraced early on. I mean, one of the first things I told you was I almost bought a house. 2 months later, I'm in grad school, moving different state. Like, who knew what was going to come of that? And with that, like, I left a pretty good job at the time, like private company, subcontracted to that JUCO, sort of 2 sources of income. Like, I was doing all right. And when I left, I'll never forget it. A mentor at that time, or I thought he was a mentor, looked at me and was like, you're wasting your time. Like, don't go to grad school just to do this. And I was like, what? And so I guess part 2 of this defining moment was like, we're taking chances and kind of betting on yourself. And for me, it was just like early, like I think sophomore, junior year undergrad, I was like, this is what I want to do. And you bet on yourself and continue to do that time after time. And again, you put in the work, like it will pay off one time or sooner or later. So there's that. But then the other piece is like, I was never afraid to talk to anybody. And like I said, I reached out to folks for that internship, but like, you know, Northeast has some powerhouse strength coaches. Like it's a small network, but really it's a huge network because how connected those folks are. And like, you just can't be afraid to hear no. And I'm trying to think, it might actually be like Ron McKeefrey's book, but like he had a no wall or something. It's been years since I read it. And like every time it was basically him being turned down, he put it up on the wall and it was just continued motivation for the next one. And so like, if a coach was like, no, I'm too busy, it was like, cool, on to the next. Cool, on to the next. And then, you know, eventually you're going to develop those relationships along the way. And I mean, if I didn't network as early as I did in my career, even though I'm a lot older than a lot of folks in terms of career age, definitely wouldn't be where I'm at right now. Not to say there wasn't luck involved, because there definitely is some luck involved with really any of this stuff. But no, those are the two huge kind of things that is like turning point for me. And as soon as I recognized those strengths, I guess you could say, it was pretty powerful.
That's awesome, man. Well, listen, Terry, I appreciate it, man. That's a great sentiment to wrap up on. You know, I think that's it's great advice. It's great insight. You know what I mean? And I think it's like I said to everybody, every time I do one of these podcasts, I learn something. And that's just a great way to kind of like, even if it's just sort of like restructuring your perception on things and like restructuring the way that you think about things and the way that you perceive, you know, yeses and nos and, you know, things that are good versus bad, like things just kind of like are, you know, what they are. Right. And you kind of need to be able to kind of like roll with it. You know what I mean? And I think that's definitely something that strength and conditioning teaches you for sure. But I'd love to give you an opportunity. Like if there's any, if you know, like you said, if people want to reach out to you and get in contact with you, give me your social media if you want, or you know, email, whatever. I can even put it in the show notes. But and then any you know, final thoughts or whatever, the floor is yours. But thank you again for hopping on. I appreciate it.
Oh man, I appreciate it. If anybody wants to reach out, I am not very active on social media. That is not who I am, but I am responsive on those platforms. So on Instagram at coach_T McClellan can reach me, and then really on LinkedIn are probably the two easiest ways to get a hold of me. Nice. And you have my email, you feel free to drop that down there. But definitely happy to talk to anybody. Hopefully some little nuggets to take away, nothing groundbreaking over here, but just stay true to yourself. Be genuine, be authentic. You'd be surprised how far that takes you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Terry, man. I appreciate it. Listeners, we'll catch you guys next time. Terry, stick around, but we'll chat in a sec. All right. That's it for everybody. We'll take you guys next time.